having good conversations. I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Emily Eisner. I'm an economist that works for the Fiscal Policy Institute. And I'm going to moderate the second housing panel for today. As we discussed in the last panel, the current housing crisis in New York has heightened rent burdens, has increased homelessness, has forced some families to leave the state altogether. Building policy solutions to address these multifaceted problems is challenging and takes many lines of attack, including increasing the overall supply of housing, as we discussed earlier, strengthening tenant protections, providing rental assistance, and other tools to create truly affordable housing for lower-income New Yorkers. This panel will be focused predominantly on questions related to the provision of housing, both market rate and affordable options. The experts with us today each have a unique view into the role that policy and the public sector play in facilitating the building of affordable housing. We know that we need to build more housing all around the country, and especially in New York, and understanding the tools that we already have to promote more affordable housing and what tools we could develop to make more housing available is a key question that we at FPI are focused on. In fact, in the next week or so, we'll release a primer on affordable housing development and financing, so look out for that. But in the meantime, today we have this amazing panel of experts with us to share their knowledge on the current landscape and what we can do to make it even easier to continue building housing in New York. So we have Jonathan Gouveia, who is NYCHA's Executive Vice President for Real Estate Development. We have Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who is the chair of the Committee on Housing and represents New York's 27th State Senate District in Brooklyn. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Brooklyn. In Manhattan, yeah, sorry. Thanks. And we have Ruth M. Wisnauskas, who is the Commissioner of the New York State Division on Housing and Community Renewal. And finally, we have Paul Williams, who is the founder and executive director of the Center for Public Enterprise. Okay. Okay, so I just gave very brief introductions. Could each of you please just introduce yourselves and explain briefly the role that you play in providing housing in New York and how it relates to the public sector? And if you're not directly involved in providing housing, how does your work contribute to that? Yeah, sure, let's start. Oh, yeah, we'll switch.
There we go. So I'm State Senator Brian Kavanaugh. I did very recently represent part of Brooklyn, but the lesser district in just lower Manhattan, everything south of 14th Street. And I chair the Senate Committee on Housing, Construction, and Community Development, which has responsibility for housing as well as all of the various construction codes that dictate how things are constructed throughout the state. I've been in this role since my Democrat colleagues and I took the majority of the Senate in 2019. And before that, I spent 11 years in the Assembly, also working a lot on housing, and have some prior experience working in city agencies overseeing some of the housing programs. And the legislature works very closely with a lot of the community organizations and advocates, and as well as the executive branch. It's great to have the commissioner here to allocate the funds and authorize various borrowing that is done by the state to produce housing, and we also are responsible for tenant protections and various other laws around fair housing and other things that are intended to make housing markets fair. And we do also have, we have various programs to protect homeowners who might be facing foreclosure, and to generally make it easier to purchase and own homes in New York. Oh, I should know, before we go, I just want to note one of my colleagues, Senator Duarte-Frisborg is here, and also Senator Bernardis is represented in the back. He's the legislative director there.
My name is Paul Williams. I'm the executive director at the Center for Public Enterprise. We don't do all that much direct work in New York today, but what we do is work with public housing authorities and state housing finance agencies around the country problem statement is that the amount of affordable housing that an agency is able to build really depends on how many dollars in low-income housing tax credits and how many dollars in tax-exempt bonds they receive from Congress each year. And so there's been quite a bit of innovation around the country over the past 5 or 10 years with agencies coming up with creative tools to do more mixed income financing. And so we've done quite a bit of work over the past 5 years or so to kind of spread some of those models, help HFAs and PHAs, housing finance agencies, and public housing authorities adopt some of those models to their context. And over the past year or so, I would say there's been kind of growing conversation in New York State about the viability of adopting some of these tools to augment and support the work that New York's already doing to provide more.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Gavaya. I'm the Executive Vice President of Real Estate Development at the New York City Housing Authority. We are, of course, New York City's public housing authority. We've got about 177,000 apartments in our portfolio. As you may have heard in the news, we need about $78 billion to get those apartments into a state of good repair. I've been with the authority since January of 2019, and the bulk of my work has thus far been focused on forming public-private partnerships to do comprehensive rehabilitations of those apartments and to put them on a more secure financial path and operating path. To date, we have converted about 23,000 apartments through this particular program, and we've got about another 15,000 in our pipeline. So we're making good progress towards preservation. As you may remember from my earlier comment about the total number of units in the portfolio, we're still climbing that hill. Actually, one of the reasons I took the job, I necessarily believe in the preservation work, but one of the reasons I took the job was actually I do believe there's a very big opportunity to look at mixed income housing to create more complete communities and to help underwrite either the rehabilitation of our apartments or create new apartments for NYCHA residents. So I think we'll probably get into that a little bit more later in the conversation, so I'll leave it there for now.
Housing agency, and all states sort of do their housing agencies a little differently. I'm very fortunate in New York State that our so the breadth of what we do is quite is great. So we finance new construction and preservation of multifamily affordable. We also finance first-time homebuyer mortgages, which could be sort of single-family homes, but also in multifamily. So we sort of act like a bank in those two respects. We also run a series of federal funding programs. So we administer home that comes from the federal government for the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program. And also we administer a Section 8 voucher program, not as large as NYCHA's, but ours is statewide. So we have about a 45,000 housing choice voucher program that we administer. In addition to those two things, we also have sort of what I would say are sort of two big regulatory footprints in the city and the state. The first is oversight of a portion of the Mitchell-Lama stock for the state of New York. The city oversees a part of it, and the state oversees another sort of series of buildings. And then we also administer the rent stabilization system that covers about 1 million apartments in New York City and surrounding counties, and now, in addition, in the laws passed in 2019, additional upstate localities opting into that. So, as a public sector voice on this panel, we have a fairly large footprint on the housing side.
Amazing. Oh, well, thank you all so much for being here. It's such amazing expertise to be able to have a conversation together. So just to lay the groundwork, I'm going to direct a question at a specific person, but I welcome other people to respond or add on and be conversational if you want to. Ruth Ann, this is sort of for you. Could you lay out just the state's major tools for building and financing new housing? What's the scale of that work currently? And I wrote down, what do you wish people understood about it?
I wish they understood how hard it was.
Yeah.
We are operating in a 5-year housing plan in the state. The city also has a housing plan, and plans are great because they lay out a goal for sort of us and the industry that all the work we do is really public-private. So it sort of lays out a framework of our goals in terms of what we're looking to achieve over that time frame, and also establishes a series of financial tools that people know are there and available to them. So as you would know from living in New York City or anywhere near here, it takes a long time in New York City and anywhere to build a building, to get it approved through the process, to get shovels in the ground, to get it built. And so developers, nonprofit, for-profit, land trust, land banks, whoever our sort of our partners are, need to know that if they're going to buy a property today, that we'll be here 2 or 3 years from now with resources that they can then use to finance that. So we have a series of programs that we put together, and we're in the 3rd year of our 5-year housing plan. We are looking to finance both new construction and preservation and homeownership and all the other programs we touch, but about 100,000 units of housing, 100,000 homes over that 5-year period. The backbone of what we do are 2 big resources that we get from the federal government. The first are tax-exempt bonds that come with low-income housing tax credits, and the second is sort of a separate allocation of what are just sort of straight low-income housing tax credits. We'll talk a little more about those, I think, as we get into the discussion. But for us, those 2 federal resources are tremendously important. They are like a but-for resource, so but for those, we really couldn't do new construction of 100% affordable housing in New York City and really in the rest of the state. They are limited, unlike some other resources that the federal government provides to low-income households, like maybe Medicaid or like SNAP or like other things that help people live affordably. We are limited in the amount of those resources that we get, and by we, certainly me and the city, because we both sort of do this really together in terms of sharing the federal resources. And so we have been limited for quite a while, we are limited by both of those. We get about $2.5 billion of tax-exempt bonds, and we get about $45 million of 9% tax credits. And we spend as much time as we can yelling and screaming to the federal government about how we need more of those every day, all day. Twice as many would be great if they could do that. And as we certainly look towards upcoming political events that are happening in the world, we are very much thinking about what that will mean for us as a state in terms of whether it's really possible that we might get more resources to increase our production of affordable housing.
Okay, thanks. That's a lot of information to take in. So I'm going to just ask, can you, just to break it down a little bit, can you talk specifically, you mentioned the low-income housing tax credit, can you talk a little bit more about those deals or how much the allocation is from the federal government and how that market or sector has changed over the past 10 years or so?
The thing I would say about the affordable housing sort of development, ecosystem in New York City and New York State is that it's awesome. We have an enormous wealth of nonprofits, as I said, sort of for-profits, land banks, also banks who are doing community development work, tax credit investors, which really an entire industry that is very focused on building it's a sort of great asset for us, that they are very smart. They are pushing the envelope as we have sort of developed over time. Just being affordable used to be kind of the baseline. Then they had to be green, and sort of green, the definition of that has changed. Now we are financing all of our new construction is required to be all electric. So our investments in affordable housing are, I think, some of the really incredible buildings that are getting built in this city and in the state. And ideally, when you drive around, you either can't distinguish the affordable from the market, or maybe in some places the affordable looks even better than the market, because we have such a great industry of professionals who use our resources, and we are trying to push them all the time to also make our resources go as far as they can. So for example, with the 9% tax credits that we use at the state, and we sub-allocate some to the city, we finance about 40 projects across the state in a year. We get about double that in demand, and so when we talk about sort of kick and scream events about how we want to double our allocations that we get, we know that we can spend it because we have double the applications on our 9% applications, and when it comes to our tax-exempt bonds, we have 2 or 3 years of deals waiting to come in, and they are into our pipeline, and they are great deals. They are serving very low-income New Yorkers. They are serving vets. They're serving formerly homeless. They're serving domestic violence survivors. They are providing. I was just in the Bronx this morning at a project at 425 Grand Concourse. If you've seen it, it's an incredibly providing services to people in those buildings and the broader community. I think I've diverted from your original question was, but I'll just pause there.
Oh, no, that's great. Yeah, I guess the original question was sort of like talking about the low-income housing tax credit market, and I think you did actually answer that question. I'll move, you mentioned the relationship that you have with the city, and that both of you are sort of working in coordination to meet sort of the affordable housing needs. So, Jonathan, you work for NYCHA, who provides housing to hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. Could you speak about some of the key innovations that you have seen and even spearheaded with NYCHA over the past 10 years? How are those innovations impacting NYCHA's mission and long-term viability?
So there's a couple of things. I think one of the biggest innovations actually came from the federal government, specifically the Obama administration. Back, I think it was around 2012, 2013, they had created the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And that's a project-based voucher program that basically allows public housing authorities to put together significant amounts of capital to do significant repairs. Now, just taking a step back, we talk in New York about conversions all the time, so just to make sure everyone is on the same page, conventional public housing is funded through what they call Section 9 funding. There's a sense that it is permanent, but it's actually not, right? It goes through the congressional budget process every year, so in theory, in any given year, the federal government can stop funding public housing. There's many elements to Section 8, but just in the interest of time, I will emphasize one. With the project-based program through RAD, what we do is we enter into 20-year contracts with HUD and with our development partners in NYCHA, and those contracts are automatically renewed. So that is what allows us and our development partners to put together the significant amounts of financing, as I said earlier, right? $78 billion to get our buildings into a state of good repair. Each one of the developments that we have requires at least tens of millions of dollars to get into a state of good repair, or even hundreds of millions of dollars. We have some developments that are going through $700 million worth of work. I mean, it's just incredible. So that program, I think, is really the RAD program, or PACT as we call it in New York City, Permanent Affordability Commitment Together, is what I think has been a great innovation for NYCHA, right? So that has been delivering results for our residents. The transformation of these apartments and the buildings has been pretty amazing. We hear all the time from residents who will say that they're so happy with, they no longer have to worry about environmental hazards. They're happy to bring family over for holidays. So it's really having a transformative effect on the lives of our residents. It's also great for NYCHA because now the operations and those responsibilities are on with a private sector partner who we oversee and ensure that they are continuing to deliver for our residents. But that allows NYCHA to then reallocate resources to other parts of the authority. In a similar vein, a couple of years ago, we created the Housing Preservation Trust with the help of our state elected officials, thank you. And so this program is very similar to the PACT program, except, it's the same in that it leverages the Section 8 vouchers that I mentioned, and it goes through that conversion process. The difference is that once the properties are converted through the program, they will continue to be managed by NYCHA management. And so this is a whole other innovation, if you will, where we're really doubling down on resident engagement and resident choice. So one of the things that I certainly spearheaded in my time was really focusing on resident engagements from 2019 over the last couple of years. We've really built out a lot of strategies around resident engagement to really understand what residents want and need, and to help get them bought into our projects and to empower the decision making. And then as it relates to the trust, now residents will have an option to pick, going with the PACT program with us, with basically the comprehensive renovations, but with private sector management, or comprehensive renovations with NYCHA management, or stay in the conventional Section 9 process. So those are just some of the big interrelated innovations that we've seen in the last few years. And then something else that we're now developing, and I alluded to earlier, is really getting into the mixed income redevelopment space. And so I'm not suggesting that every development will be rebuilt or redeveloped, but we need to look at our portfolio carefully and think about what are the buildings that make sense for preservation, and what are the developments or buildings that might need to be rebuilt. And so the first project that we're doing along these lines is Fulton and Elliott Chelsea on the west side of Manhattan. their residents who live in about 2,056 apartments, between the two developments, made the decision to go through a process of completely rebuilding those apartments. So we will rebuild 2,056 apartments. We will build additional affordable housing and new market rate housing, as well as new commercial space, community spaces. And one of the great things about this is leveraging the land value in Chelsea to do this without city capital subsidy. We are looking to other partners potentially for tax-exempt bonds and LIHTC and the like, but it will not require city capital subsidy, which we think is an important feature of this program or this initiative, because of course the city's resources are obviously constrained.
Awesome, thanks so much. So now I'm going to take it to Paul. Can you, we just heard a bunch of innovations happening in the city, what the tools are in the state. Could you speak to innovations in affordable housing finance that you've seen around the country and how those relate to the tools that we currently have in New York, or what is being innovated against you?
Sure, yeah, and actually I'll start with one that NYCHA has also used for one of the PACT deals. So kind of start explaining it with, we're here talking a lot about the problems that housing scarcity creates. When there's scarcity, there's this increased competition, increased costs, all these difficulties. It's the same thing for scarce, limited, affordable housing subsidy resources. So as Ruthanne was mentioning, she may get 80 applications for those slots for affordable housing development, but only have resources for 40. And so anyone that gets funded means there's one that's not getting funded. And when an agency like NYCHA is doing big redevelopment projects, they also oftentimes need those resources, particularly the tax-exempt bonds. There is a relatively new resource that the federal government created about 10 years ago called, it's kind of a HUD, a partnership with the Treasury Department, the Federal Financing Bank, and it's able to provide this debt that you can use instead of using those tax-exempt bonds. So it kind of takes a little bit of pressure off of the competition for those resources. And I know NYCHA's used that for a couple of their RAD impact projects. And so a number of other agencies around the country have started looking to that particular tool as something to say, if I want to put together a capital stack, a couple of financial resources to build a building without using any of those scarce resources, not because I don't like those resources, but because there's so few of them, and I need to, if I want to do something on top of that, I need to come up with some other creative ways to use my resources. So this Federal Financing Bank tool can provide some debt for housing authorities. And the other piece that goes into a typical project is, in an affordable deal, it'll be equity in the form of low-income housing tax credit equity. In a market rate deal, it'll be private equity. So some other piece of capital that goes in at that construction period is really what's needed. And we've seen housing authorities and housing finance agencies who have typically not done this kind of construction lending start to get into this space in the past few years and put together these pretty significant pipelines of, again, mixed income projects that they're able to get done without using those bonds and without using those tax credits. And again, I just want to reiterate, not because those resources are bad, but because we only have so many of them. And any tools that we can put together to do additional affordability on top of that, additional production on top of that, provide value both in what they produce and in their ability to kind of take pressure off of that fierce competition for these scarce resources. So we've seen, and there's been a lot of different implementations of this. It's not really kind of a one-size-fits-all thing. There are public housing authorities like in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., where the housing authority itself is putting these resources together and doing the development itself in kind of a joint venture fashion, very similar to the way NYCHA does a lot of its development. But there are also housing finance agencies. We saw Mass Housing, the state housing finance agency in Massachusetts, created a program just this summer where they have a revolving loan fund that we'll be making these kind of mezzanine construction investments into projects that otherwise would not be able to be supported through their federal resources.
Cool, there's a lot there, and I'm gonna come back to some of the ideas that were just mentioned by all three of you, but before sort of probing further, Senator Kavanaugh, you are the chair of the Housing Committee in the State Senate, and you hold the Housing Access Voucher Program bill as well as other bills. Could you speak to the role of state financing or state fiscal policy, or not just fiscal policy, state policy in general, and how it interacts with sort of the efforts that we're talking about?
Yeah, thanks. So I think a few things have changed pretty fundamentally in the last 5 or 6 years in our approach to housing. First of all, beginning in 2019, we have been taking much more seriously the idea of preserving the net amount of affordable housing. So in 2019, for example, we passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which eliminated deregulation of the rent stabilized stock and also provided eviction protections all over the state. So most of the coverage of that bill related to the rent stabilization system, which was very significant. We'll get back to that in a second. But in Buffalo, in the latter half of 2019, we saw a dramatic reduction in evictions, because we added some protections that had been sort of were de facto in place in New York City, but largely you could go in many upstate jurisdictions. You could go from the day your rent is due to a marshal on your doorstep in about 2 weeks to remove you from your home. So that began a focus on eviction protection, and rent stabilization lost 300,000 units to deregulation during the course of about 20 years, which is, nearly the rate of all housing production in New York City per year. And that's all housing production. It's not all affordable housing production. So having a system where Ruth Ann and HPD and everybody are doing such a great job, and I agree with Ruth Ann, we have a terrific set of people who know how to produce housing and know how to use scarce resources to produce housing. But as long as you're producing lots of affordable housing and you're losing enormous amounts of housing on the other end, you're not keeping up. And one of the main reasons New York is so unaffordable right now is decades of deregulation. We also began focusing on rental assistance. In 2020, it was the second year that we had Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature. I think we thought we would get into a mode of looking forward to new innovative policy, and instead we really dealt with the emergency of COVID in basically all aspects of our lives. But New York State implemented the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, a statewide program to provide rent to anyone who applied who could not afford the rent because they lost income during COVID. And unlike any other state in America, we got $3 billion from the federal government. We added $1 billion, all told, of state resources to ensure that we were fully covering that. And I think it's a significant precedent. And the executive as well as the legislature worked very hard to identify all the money necessary to process every application. And that was a highly successful program. We continue to need to focus on, again, stabilizing what we've got, maintaining what we've got. New York the state has now also, as a matter of course, each year, the only year we didn't put money into capital for NYCHA was the COVID budget, which was just, we had a lot of tough choices to make that year. But roughly speaking, we're spending a couple $100 million subsidizing NYCHA, which is not nearly enough, but before that there was no real state commitment to public housing in New York, or to the capital needs of NYCHA at all. We are now, a lot of us in the legislature, pushing for a greater focus on rental assistance. The sort of crown jewel of that effort is something called the Housing Access Voucher Program. It is a bill, again, we wrote it in the latter half of 2019, thinking like, let's get going on this. And we've been, I think, a little bit diverted from that by the need to respond to COVID as an emergency. But that is a program that would create a state-run program similar to Section 8 that could be administered through the same entities that administer Section 8 who already know how to do it because the rules would be similar, but put a great many vouchers in the hands of folks across the state that can stabilize people housing. And Section 8 really is a remarkably successful program. As probably most people in this room know, it basically covers the difference between fair market rent and 30% of the household's income. So it doesn't have some of the problems of some of the public assistance program where there's a cliff, you become eligible and you lose the entire benefit. If your income goes up, your contribution to your rent goes up a bit, but it stays affordable. And it's a remarkable way of stabilizing people's housing. We believe in many areas of our lives, if states like New York just depended on what the federal government is willing to provide, we would not meet the public needs that we have. So in many areas of our lives, we spend a great deal of state and city resources to augment what we get from the federal government. This is a high priority for a lot of us. Last year, the other thing that I and some of my colleagues have been focusing on increasingly in recent years is eviction prevention through when it's not a matter of, like, so last year, I know you talked in the earlier panel about good cause eviction, but that is a huge change for 1 million tenants in New York City, and as localities upstate roll it out, people will have the right to remain in their homes as long as they're willing to pay their rent and meet their obligations, and maybe have reasonable increases as you go forward. But we still have enormous amounts of eviction, especially outside New York City, based on people's inability to pay rent. So in New York City, I don't have the current fiscal year numbers, but in the last fiscal year, New York City arranged to pay the rent of 45,000 households, where if that rent and those arrears were not paid, they would have been evicted. And eviction is an enormous scourge. It is tremendously disruptive to families, to education, to health outcomes. And New York City, although we still have an enormous crisis here, has largely found a way to keep people in homes when they have an apartment and the only issue is they can't pay their rent. That largely does not happen outside New York City. So last year we got a pilot program that has now been launched by the state social services agency. Every locality outside New York City now has money to pilot their ability to pay rent when people will otherwise face eviction. So I say all that, I know none of that is about production, but I think it's critical to recognize that this whole thing exists in it's an ecosystem, and if people are losing homes every day in your community, building new housing is sort of slim comfort. We have also been focusing on kind of making sure we're doing production programs that meet people's needs. The legislature initiated a program that is basically our attempt at a kind of social housing, a new social housing program intended to focus particularly on state-owned land. We put $150 million behind that, $75 million for homeowner opportunities and $75 million for rentals. We also, working with some of my upstate colleagues, develop programs that are intended to provide infill development in a smaller scale in neighborhoods where that might be appropriate, and to renovate existing buildings, 1, 2, 3 family homes that provide a lot of the rental housing in upstate communities.
Thank you so much, and there's so much meat there to unpack. I guess I'm wondering if the other panelists might want to jump in and talk about sort of some of these like state fiscal policies that are either active or being proposed, like how those interact with your work, or if they do at all. Yeah.
I could chime in on one sort of piece of that, which is I think that one of the other things that has very much entered the conversation, both in New York City and also statewide, is also the role of zoning and the role of municipalities in the production of housing. So while we are resource constrained from tax credits that we get from the federal government, we also are constrained by localities who don't permit housing or who have barriers in place that take permitting housing take much longer than it otherwise should. And so I think as right now sort of very current, or the city of yes is going through a process where obviously that is aiming to increase a little bit of housing everywhere, I think is the tagline. We feel that same way sort of at the state level, that we would also like there to be a little bit of housing being built all over, whether that's Long Island and Westchester or Rochester, Buffalo, and everywhere in between. And so I think that's sort of an important kind of maybe player that's entered into this in a way that it wasn't so much 5 years ago, which is that unless localities are really planning for and accommodating growth, because we want to grow as a city and as a state, we end up with very it's sort of a piece of this conversation too, that it's around zoning and incentivizing localities to permit more really housing of all types. Obviously, we are focused, a little myopically on affordable housing, but really all types of housing.
I guess I can actually respond to both comments. So first, we obviously, I think, benefited greatly, and our residents benefit from the various rental assistance programs that came from the state and others. So thank you again for that. We had significant rental arrears within the NYCHA portfolio, and so this was a great relief to our residents to keep them in their housing. So critically important. And then on the topic of zoning, NYCHA is in an interesting situation. We actually have about 80 million square feet of unused development rights across the entire portfolio. So, and that's with current zoning and the existing building footprints that we have. So theoretically, we could be doing a lot of construction in many parts of the city. Most of our sites are zoned primarily for residential and don't allow other uses. So to the extent that there's greater flexibility around creating commercial space as well, that would certainly be helpful for us. In some developments, we do have the mixed zoning, which allows for different uses. But again, I guess the main takeaway is that we actually are primed to be able to build, just given the amount of unused square footage that we have.
I'll just say something about zoning too. That this is, I often get asked this. People are kind of curious about some of the new mixed income tools that are starting to be deployed by agencies around the country. Have questions about zoning. I was actually just down at a groundbreaking event, not New York, but in Maryland, just outside of DC, for a new 500-unit big mixed income project that Montgomery County's Public Housing Authority is building. New construction, passive house, net zero, really fantastic project. That project was delayed by 18 months because the design review board of Montgomery County had kind of this broad authority to just say, no, well, actually, we're going to stop here and you're going to submit all these additional things. The time from when they were ready to close on that transaction to when they actually closed, interest rates went up about 4.5%, which added close to $50 million to the total cost of that project. Luckily, they were still able to make the numbers work and get it closed and get that project under construction. It's now underway. It's going to be great. But all of these kind of barriers to affordable housing production, they impact everything. I think there's a kind of perception that maybe it's just market rate that's impacted, but it's 100% affordable housing. It's mixed income housing. It's every kind of housing that gets built that is really significantly constrained by all of these often, disparate impact processes with different actors.
A few of you have mentioned mixed income housing. I'm wondering if we could just dive into that a little bit deeper and talk about sort of what the mechanism is. How do we leverage mixed income to sort of create more affordable units? How has that worked historically and how is it working now?
I could say a couple things. I would say in New York City, there are two very strong incentives that create the mixed income housing that most people would sort of be familiar with, I think. So we have a zoning code that has an inclusionary zoning provision. So as new buildings in certain areas get built, there is this zoning bonus and zoning requirement around affordability, which is great, which means sort of as the city grows and as buildings get built in every neighborhood, there is sort of in that same vein of a little bit of affordable housing in all those areas where inclusionary zoning exists. We also have a tax exemption in the city of New York. We used to be called 421A and is now called 45X, that if you're housing wonky housing world we're very familiar with. And that tax incentive very much drives the, from an economic standpoint, the creation of those affordable set-asides in what are otherwise market rate mixed income buildings. And again, I think it's great, right? As the city is growing, it means rather than having an all affordable building and an all market rate building, we are getting affordability in market rate buildings as they get built in neighborhoods across the city. Those tools don't really exist so much outside of New York City, and so it's much harder to get mixed income buildings built. There are some localities that have adopted inclusionary zoning, and there are sort of tax incentive structures that exist in other places, but they are not as of right, so people have to go negotiate them one by one. So one of the things, and Paul is certainly sort of spearheading, I think, a lot of this conversation outside of New York State, for sure, around what types of tools are needed to create mixed income housing in a world where there isn't mandatory inclusionary, where there aren't tax incentives, where frankly the market isn't strong enough to make a tax incentive sort of create that level of mixed income housing. And so I think the conversation has also risen up to the level of the federal government, in which to say there has not been a ton of innovations or tools coming out of the federal government to help drive the construction of mixed income rental housing in places that don't have the market rate rents. That in New York City we have market rate rents that are, you all know, that are really, really strong, are really high, and those market rate rents can create a lot of affordability. And that's not true in a lot of places where market rate rents aren't that strong. You don't see as many buildings getting built other places, they're not as big, and a lot of that is sort of the math on how much does it cost to build a building, and how much does it rent for, and can you pay your mortgage, and can you pay your expenses, and a building runs just like all of our sort of personal financials do. You have to sort of make all your expenses every month. And so I think it's really interesting to be thinking about outside of sort of our traditional kind of, certainly at the state level, our kind of like all affordable, sort of the four walls of affordable housing, to really be thinking more broadly about how do we get more mixed income housing built in other places, certainly outside of New York City, where it doesn't come so easily, just on sort of the pure economic side.
I certainly agree with all of that. And then I guess as it relates to NYCHA specifically, and I've already alluded to this a few times, I think one of the greatest assets we have is development rights, but also a significant amount of land. So the piece that we can leverage or tap into in the NYCHA context is that land value. And obviously our first priority will be making sure that there's new housing for NYCHA residents. But given the amount of space that we have on a lot of our campuses, we could add additional housing. So just to go back to Fulton for a second, right? There's 2,056 apartments that will be completely rebuilt, brand new modern apartments for NYCHA residents. But then you're going to add about 2,400 units of market rate plus another 1,000 of affordable. Again, as I mentioned before, that's not being paid for with city capital dollars. That's primarily the market, the land value that's helping to drive that. So, again, in the neighborhoods where it makes sense, we can look to this model and leveraging the tools that were then mentioned to try to get more production.
I'm just going to say, there are a couple of other kind of historical, and I guess I can tell a little bit about, this kind of resurgence of interest in mixed income. It's not entirely new. There's an aspect of it that's new, but there's actually quite a long history, several decades of history after the creation of the low-income housing tax credit of doing what are referred to in the affordable housing industry as 80-20 deals, where there's a requirement for certain federal resources to have a minimum amount of affordability at these low-income levels. And so there's a number of housing authorities that did these mixed income deals in the 90s and 2000s, and some in the 2010s that kind of fell out of favor. But that's really where this kind of interest in doing, and I want to highlight this kind of construction lending using revolving funds is really the kind of core innovation that we've seen agencies take up around the country is really being able to finance similar kinds of mixed income projects, but without putting that low-income housing tax credit equity, having another source from a revolving fund that can come in place of what would be tax credit equity, and with some other resources able to get higher than that 80-20 mix, closer to 2/3, 1/3. Again, very much depending on the strength of the market rents that are in the area. But I think that's one way to think about some of these tools. Is really it's an opportunity area tool, right? In places where you have really high land values, which means you probably have very good schools, you have very good amenities, you have all these things that people want to be around. You can actually just leverage that resource of the land value to create additional affordability that you would otherwise couldn't pay for.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna take this opportunity to pitch my own report on housing, for affordable housing finance, because some of these ideas that we're talking about, not to be condescending, but they're complicated. It's complicated to think about how you make these deals work, and so we'll be coming out with like a primer that's a explainer for this. But to try to kind of make this accessible for people, I guess I'm gonna ask a question that I think kind of brings some of these ideas together. I want to be able to bring in the revolving loan fund, the mixed income, the role of the tax exempt bonds, all of this. This is a really big picture question, but I'm just wondering how you all conceptualize the cost of providing affordable housing. Maybe this is taking a step back, but like this is building any housing, especially in New York City and the state. It's expensive, and then building it at affordable rates adds a layer of expense. I'm just wondering if you could sort of talk us through how you think about that, the costs, and break that down for folks who are not sort of as deep in the weeds.
I guess we can judge it. Do you want to go?
You first.
It is expensive to build buildings everywhere, and it doesn't cost much less to build, in in rural upstate New York and in other cities in upstate New York as it does downstate. It might be, we're not generally building very tall buildings upstate, although the cities we do, but the costs can kind of be not that different, and yet the rents are obviously very different. Market rate rents in Buffalo and Rochester are very different than market rate rents in New York City, and you get back to this sort of like but for when it comes to affordability, that if you are building housing where you're looking at rents that are $800, $900, $1,500, $2,000, depending where on the affordability spectrum you are relative to locality, it costs more to build that housing than you can pay for with those rents. We mostly are trying to make sure that it costs, that you can cover the expenses to run the buildings with the rents, but it's also really expensive to operate buildings. It is expensive to pay for staff, because you want to pay them well and give them benefits and give them raises every year, or have contract rents or contract salaries that you're maintaining. Insurance, there's been an enormous amount of talk, and this is true really single family and multifamily, but in the multifamily sector and in the affordable sector, insurance rates have doubled and tripled for some owners, and as owners are not allowed to double or triple rents. They're only allowed either in the rent state stock to go by rent state, or in our buildings not dissimilar, by 2 or 3% a year, and they may get a 100% increase in an insurance bill. Utilities have gone up, for sure. People see this in their own buildings too. So it's really expensive to operate buildings, and we, for the most part, in the state and the city and the regulatory stock are regulating rent increases, or in the rent stabilized stock, they're regulated. So it is really hard not only just to make the economics of building a building work, but you can't sort of support a mortgage based on what it costs. And we are, at the moment, also just very focused on making sure people can maintain buildings, which is a two-sided of people have to pay their rent, and also expenses are going up, as well as making sure they can invest in them from a capital perspective. So, all buildings over time need new roofs, and they need repairs, and they need new boilers, and so making sure there's sort of money available to make those kind of investments. We have a very old housing stock, a very beautiful housing stock, but a very old housing stock in New York State that needs a lot of, Jonathan's, I think, numbers on NYCHA bear that out for sure, but it's true in the rest of the stock also, that there's, so I think that's a sort of a big challenge, and what makes the whole thing kind of an industry is always trying to figure out how to keep producing something that isn't always economic, but that is not economic, sort of, but for governmental and sort of public-private partnership investment.
I'll just jump in and say, first of all, in a very different and ideal world, we would pay attention to wage policy and healthcare policy and other ways that would ensure that people have the resources necessary to live a basic, decent, stable life. So a few years back, we had a big fight over the minimum wage in New York, and we used to fight very hard to get the minimum wage to go from $8.75 to $9 an hour. And the retail industry in New York would tell us, unemployment will soar, and no one will hire anybody at $9 an hour. And eventually we made the leap up to $15 an hour, and now it's at 16, if I'm not mistaken, in New York City. It is still 7.25 in much of the country. So you know, we live in a world where many people cannot earn the money necessary to pay the cost out of their own earnings of a decent, stable place to live. We also know that a decent, stable place to live is a fundamental basis for, you know, getting your kids in schools, getting education, your own health, the health of your family members. So I think we do need to think of it more as a fundamental necessity in a way that we haven't. We don't think of housing as something that the government should cover the full cost of. We have these programs and we cap them. So I think one answer is, HCR and the other agencies here are really good at spending money that we make available to them to produce new housing, new very good quality housing. We need to admit to ourselves that if we're going to address this problem, we really do need to spend more resources. And again, ideally, that would happen at the national level. We have at least one presidential candidate that's talking about a greater need to invest in housing that hopefully will be the president. But either way, I think we in New York need to recognize that we need to do a lot more. We need to spend more. We need to put more resources. We need to do it as efficiently as possible. But at current levels of spending, we're not, for example, supportive housing. A lot of need for supportive housing. We used to produce about 1,200 units a year through state programs, and we upped that to 1,400 units. And HCR has very efficiently made those, the money comes in, and the projects are proposed, and they're funded, and they move out. If we gave those programs more resources, there would be more supportive housing, and we know there's a need. So I think just pushing for, the political change that would be necessary to put housing, more money in. And I'm just going to make one more pitch since I was silent on this issue before, but the ability of localities to block housing was the governor very courageously came forward and said she was going to address that, and took on the suburbs and was pushed back substantially by some of my colleagues in the legislature and local governments. But if you are in New York City and you think we have a housing crisis in New York City, we substantially have a housing crisis because our suburbs do not permit anybody to build housing. And in Long Island in particular, it is almost, every time I say this, somebody will point out the exception, but it is almost impossible to build multifamily housing, rental housing, or affordable housing on Long Island. And as long as that is the case, this metropolitan area that has had increases in population, that has the economy producing new jobs that the governor always cites, as long as we are allowing localities to block housing, we're going to continue to have the kind of scarcity that we have now.
I was also going to say, I think, to that question of, fundamentally, what are we paying for with affordable housing? And the way I always think about it is much like the Section 8, when we're paying the difference between market rent and what is affordable to a tenant. All of our tools for affordable housing are fundamentally doing that same thing, right? It costs quite a bit of money to build, even just on the construction side. We want those to be good paying jobs and safe jobs. We want workplace safety. We want high quality materials, and add all of those costs up, and there are some places in the country where even market rent isn't enough to pay down the debt on a high quality project like that, much less an affordable rent. So the tools that we have are Section 8 tools, which help the tenant by increasing the income that's able to go toward paying the rent, or we have tools like low-income housing tax credit, which doing a very similar thing where you put more low-income housing tax credits into a building and you're lowering the debt payments that the building has to make on the back end, right? So those tenant rents that are coming in are closer to enough to cover those costs. And so, I think the way it's this fundamental problem, we're covering that gap, we're covering that in between, and anything that we can do that either brings down, anything we can do that reduces the size of that gap is also really impactful for affordable housing development. And so that's things like increasing wages. Anything that we can do to increase wages helps make it easier for people to afford housing, helps make the job of providing affordable housing easier, as does anything that we can do to reduce construction costs and operating costs without sacrificing the quality that we want in affordable housing. housing. So again, zoning is one of those things. If you have to wait 3, 4, 5 years to go through this process of a Long Island suburb rejecting your project over and over, you're holding that land for all of those years, and on the back end, your land is paying for all of those holding costs, which reduces the amount of affordable housing you can build. So, compressing those things makes the job of covering that gap easier for affordable housing providers.
Okay, we're on the last question here, and we're gonna have to make it a little quick. So it's, where is it? What do you wish people knew about your work that would help you do a better job and direct energy to the right places?
I guess I'll just say that I think more people should engage in, first of all, educating yourselves. Like let me take a moment to thank Emily and Nathan also and everybody at Fiscal Policy Institute for putting on this very educational and I look forward to your paper. And just to say that, first of all, educating people themselves about these issues and advocating. If you were in New York City right now, the city of yes, it's been mentioned, city of yes for housing, you may not agree with all of it, or you may have concerns about it, but it is going to be decided one way or the other on a fixed clock by the first week of December. And that is a very big set of changes that are intended to increase the supply of housing in general and affordable housing in particular. Same at the state level. We need more people. The problem with advocating for new housing is that the beneficiaries are diffuse. If you have housing, if you're in stable housing, if you theoretically like to live in some other community, you're not advocating in that community for new housing. You build that community because you don't live there. We need people to engage in the question of what our society needs to do to produce more housing. Get involved in Albany, get involved in Washington if you can, and if you're here in New York City, get involved at City Hall level.
I think in my work, what I wish, I think that it's easy to look at a situation of affordable housing in a community, in a state, and think that if there's not enough, that somehow the agency is to blame for that. And I think that that's very much not the case. There may be some situations where there's bad actors or whatever, but in general, the housing agencies that we have around the country are really doing everything that they can to find creative solutions to produce as much affordable housing as possible, and are really doing so much more that just really doesn't get praised or doesn't get recognized or doesn't get seen, even because people don't you don't see anything that happens until you start to see shovels in the ground. You didn't see the 5-year process of providing technical support to that nonprofit as they were trying to identify a piece of land, as they were trying to underwrite that project, as they were trying to identify architecture and engineering partners to help them build this new affordable housing property. And it's the public agencies who are doing all of that work on the back end. And I think it's something that I recognize in my work, how dedicated the agencies are.
I'm going to answer a slightly different question and just talk about what we need to do at NYCHA. So I mentioned this in my opening remarks. We put a lot of effort into engagement and really working with residents and really explaining our various initiatives, whether it's the PAC program that I run, or the new Housing Preservation Trust, or concepts like mixed income, mixed use that we've been talking about through this conversation. And we do that because it's the right thing to do, but we also do it because we have to do it, right? Within NYCHA and across public housing authorities across the country for decades, there's a history, unfortunately, of various broken promises, right? Additionally, there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of suspicion about what's going on. So, the way we counteract that is to really invest a lot of time and effort into engagement and really trying to get the word out that we are here to make sure that, as it relates to NYCHA, that our residents are being put into better housing, right, as quickly as possible, and that we want them to have a say in that.
I think I would say, I would want people to know that we understand at the state level that when we are building a new apartment someone who is struggling to pay their rent tomorrow or the day after, like 100% get that. But we also know that building and supply of housing, and to the senator's point, in places like Long Island, in Westchester, in New York City, where will help relieve the pressure that people feel every day because we need more supply. Right? The market is too tight, there is no vacancy, there is nowhere for anybody to go. And it's a long game, and it's going to take us a little while to build what we need. And we've heard whether it was the mayor's moonshot or the governor's 800,000 unit, to think about doubling the amount of housing that gets produced in the city and the state today is a large task, and it's going to take us, a decade to get there. And I acknowledge that does not help the person who can't pay the rent tomorrow, but we have to be focused on breaking down barriers to supply and on getting more resources for supply, because we're not going to get out of this another way unless we, pay some, money falling from the sky from Washington or something, unless we really keep pushing on, doubling our housing production everywhere where there's demand for it.
Amazing. Okay, well, on that note, I want to thank all of you so much for being here and for this great conversation. You're released, and we have a very short break, so
We're just gonna do a little 5-minute pause here.
minute break to go to the bathroom, stretch your legs, and then we'll have our final panel.
I do want to say, while you're all still a captive audience, thanks to all of our panelists and FPI staff for what has been some really good discussions. In particular to Emily, who was the driving force and visionary behind the conference. Monica, for handling our communications. And to Sarah over here, who's made sure that things do not fall apart